Life is so priceless. An engaged life is so priceless. Oftentimes, the older folks in our families will tell us stories that we've heard before, and it's not been uncommon for me to interject and begin to predict where the story is going in attempt to make my family member feel heard, as if I recognize this story. I've heard it before, and I chose not to do that tonight. You see, my grandma was telling me a story that she began to tell me earlier this week and did not get too deep into. As we were out in the yard, she was taking the dogs out, I was working out. We were just kind of in a passing, so the conversation didn't have the chance to develop to much depth. But tonight, I'm sleeping over at my grandma's, and she began to tell the story that she was telling earlier this week, beginning to talk about her mother and father. And I chose not to interject, not to claim that I recognized this story. But I nodded and I kept listening, and she began to develop the story in more depth, and there was a newness to it that I had not heard before, though I had heard the story 4 times before. And she went on, and she went on. For 2 hours I sat in the dining room, transported back to the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, and even further back into the early 1900s, when my grandfather was cowboying in Wyoming and gold mining in Alaska, and ultimately settling back down in Missouri to sharecrop on their family farm, where they sold a few calves a year and lived on that and sold crates of eggs. She told me about the introduction of electricity into the household, about their first radio and the wire they had to wrap around the whole house and up the top. She told me that my great-grandfather, John, her dad, which I took notes in my fingers at the bar in the kitchen. Her great-grandfather, when he was cowboying out in Wyoming, that he and his cowboy friends would hear stories of famous outlaw Butch Cassidy, where he was from Utah, but he was ultimately caught stealing horses in Wyoming, where they were. And she was talking about Wild Bill and how her dad would tell her, Wild Bill, he's not a real cowboy. He was a bit of just kind of a showman, kind of a circus act. And then he'd go on to tell her stories about real cowboying. And she would tell me about the bums, she called them, the hobos that would come through, and they'd be passing through town, and great grandpa John would always give them a meal to eat. And and her mom would always say, don't give them anything jarred, because her mother, grandma's mother, would farm like 3 acres of land, one mostly potatoes, one mostly tomatoes, one mostly cucumbers, and she'd jar them. And she wasn't like stingy about the food, but she didn't want her jars to get lost. And then sometimes they would have gypsies come through the towns, and he would be the same manner that he was to everyone else. Those folks in town on the bank steps, or the bums that would pass through, he always treated everybody with much respect, and he would go out there and talk to them and give them food as well. But he'd always point into town towards more civilization, and he'd stand out there and watch them go, so that they didn't make settlement there in the night and steal any chickens. Grandma used to envy the kids that would ride their ponies to school. The one little schoolhouse with all the grades, some of the kids would ride ponies, and her dad informed her not only did they not have the money to afford another creature, but it was no life for an animal to be roped up all day while she was at school. She did, however, say that one day they rode one pony, 4 of them, and there was a little boy sitting behind her, and how the slope of the pony's derriere is shaped. The boy started falling off naturally at some point, and he pulled her down, and she pulled the other kids down, and they fell off, like a big Charlie Brown incident in my mind. And they all started cackling out in laughter on the ground. And she got into the difficulties of growing up during that era, and she told me about how the good old days really weren't all that good. They were tough, but when you didn't know any better, it was all right. And it reminds me of Viktor Frankl's writing in the Holocaust. And though, they didn't undergo persecution by some sort of tyrannical force, they were subject to a certain tyranny that exists living in nature off the land. Her father subscribed to a periodical, Grit, and I looked that up, and that was a newspaper, I think monthly newspaper, and it covered rural living, tips, tricks, news. And he had a horse. He would farm with the horses. He'd till the land with the horses, and he'd go out and handle the cattle and the horses. He seemed like a really cool guy. He would go into town on the weekends, and they'd have an auction, and they'd auction off books, and he'd bring back books. She said he was mostly self-educated. There was a time when he had the chance to have an apprenticeship with a doctor, and he claimed that there was a blackboard there, chalkboard, and he couldn't handle the dust there. His lungs were weak. His mother, Grandma's grandma, died of tuberculosis. Occasionally, when it was raining too hard, Grandma couldn't walk to school or eventually ride her bike that they bought from the neighbor boy. Great-grandpa John would drive her to school in the carriage. She talked to me about forgiving her mother for the way she was treated. Just a whole lot of priceless stuff that I would not have known. I think if I just nodded along and said I recognized it. And came back upstairs and started scrolling social media. Life is so priceless. An engaged life is so priceless. That's all I got for now. Have a good one. I'll try to do the same.